Hey everyone. Tonight we're stepping barefoot onto the frozen floor of a one-room cottage somewhere in 14th century Europe. No mattress, no coffee, no alarm clock unless you count your ribs knocking against your insides, or the icy air that feels like it's chewing on your face. You're not waking up in luxury. You're not even waking up in comfort. You're waking up in survival mode. And tonight, we're going to find out if you could last just one day in the life of a medieval peasant. Spoiler, you might not. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Drop a comment with your location and local time. Let's see where this little village of ours stretches across the world. Now, turn down the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started on tonight's journey together. You open your eyes to blackness. Not modern, soft lit midnight, but a kind of dark that doesn't blink. No streetlights, no glowing clocks, no screens humming quietly from the corner of the room. Just the distant hiss of last night's fire trying not to die, and the breath of cold air dragging across the packed dirt floor. Your shoulders ache before you even move. You slept on straw. Again, it's matted, damp, and smells faintly of your youngest child's accident. You shift and immediately regret it. Your joints protest with the subtle grace of rusted iron. Knees, elbows, hips, they creak like they're trying to start a conversation about retirement. But retirement isn't a concept you get to consider. You're 34, which in this world means you're already pushing elder status if you've got all your teeth. One's loose, by the way. You've been pretending not to notice. The hearth is low. Embers glow like shy fireflies under a collapsed pyramid of charcoal bones. You rise slowly and pad barefoot to the stone edge, where your fingers fumble with the kindling. You don't have much left. You used most of it last night. You didn't think about the morning. Now, your breath fogs in front of you like a ghost of that mistake. You press your hands to the stones, hoping to warm them before daring to feed the fire. It's a pitiful hope. The stones are colder than you. You work quickly anyway, trying not to wake the rest of the house. The youngest is still curled up beside your spouse, legs tangled in old blankets, mouth slightly open like she's mid-dream. You'd give anything to know what she's dreaming about. Anything to have one less hungry mouth today. You crouch and blow into the coals. A slow, measured breath. The kind you learned from watching your grandfather before he faded like the fire you're nursing now. A flicker, yes. A curl of smoke. You add a twig. Then another, carefully. Like handling a baby bird with arthritis. Eventually, a flame. It's not much, but it's alive. The smoke curls up toward the thatch, joining the rest of the grime clinging to the ceiling beams like soot tattoos. You blink through the haze and check the pot. It's iron, cracked at the lip, blackened from years of fire kisses and too many dinners that tasted like disappointment. You lift the lid. Empty. Of course it's empty. You knew it was empty, but hope is a funny kind of liar, and you let it whisper to you anyway. You scrape the bottom with the spoon. There's a bit of dried something clinging to the edge. Might be barley. Might be old turnip. Might be regret. You add water from the jug lukewarm because you kept it near the fire overnight. Not because you're clever, just because you forgot to put it away. You stir slowly, trying to convince yourself that it's soup now. The fire crackles. You glance outside. It's still night, but the kind of night that hints at morning. You can't see the sun, but the cold has changed from deep bone chill to early gut slap. You wrap a shawl over your shoulders and sit by the hearth, watching the water move in lazy swirls. You count them, not because it matters, just because it gives your eyes something to do other than look at the cupboard. There's no bread. You ate the last chunk last night. Shared it, actually. Gave your daughter the center, softest part. You took the crust, always the crust, the kind that could double as a roof tile if you left it out too long. You didn't care. You were proud. That's what parents do. The pot steams slightly now, not boiling, just exhaling. You take a wooden bowl and pour some of the hot water in. It's not soup. It's not even broth. It's a warm lie, but it helps. At least it helps until midday. You sip carefully. It tastes like, well, warmth. Like nothing flavored with smoke and disappointment. And yet, you feel it slide down your throat, land softly in your belly, and tell your body, we're not done yet. You hold the bowl between your hands and think about work. The field. The Lord's quota. The aching back and bent knees. The blisters on your hands that never seem to close fully. The mud that gets into places you don't talk about. You think about whether today is a hope someone left a bone at the manor kind of day, or a dig until your arms scream kind of day. Probably both. You finish the last sip. It's not satisfying, but it's something, which in your world is everything. And still, the day hasn't really begun. You reach for your boots. They're stiff. You'll need to walk slowly to loosen the leather before the soles crack again. You whisper a silent thought, not quite a prayer, not quite a plan. Just a hope that tonight, maybe, the pot won't be empty. Your daughter stirs. You turn. She opens her eyes, sleepy and wide. Is there breakfast, she asks. You smile. Sort of, not yet, you say, but soon. She nods, trusting you. And that trust, that's what's going to carry you through today. Whether it should or not. The pot is warm now, but not full. You swirled water around its edges, hoping to coax flavor from last night's ghost of pottage. But really, it's a thin broth with the dreams of being useful. Still, you sip. The heat helps, if not the taste. If you're lucky and you're not, you'll find a barley flake or onion skin on the spoon. You don't complain. Complaints don't cook grain. The fire pops and sighs behind you as you pull on your boots. They're made of stiff leather, the kind that remembers the shape of your foot but forgets to forgive you for it. One heel is cracked, stitched last week with a thread made from rabbit sinew in desperation. You stand slowly, adjusting your balance. Your spine makes a noise like a door hinge too proud to ask for oil. The door groans as you open it, cold air slicing across your face. You step outside, into a world that isn't awake yet but is already waiting. The village path is half-frozen mud, half-frozen manure. You squint through morning fog that smells faintly of damp wool, old ash, and the communal pig pen. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster coughs. Not Crow's coughs. He's old, like you, and just trying to make it through another day. You start walking. The workshop is half a field away, past the well, the crumbled wall, and the tree that everyone keeps promising to cut down before it falls on someone important. Your fingers ache as you adjust your grip on the wooden bucket. It's empty. For now. But maybe not for long. You got a job to do. Sort of. You're not a craftsman. Not by medieval standards. You don't have a license from the guild. But you know how to make things. Things from the earth. Clay, mostly. Bowls, cups. Jars for pickled cabbage. And sometimes, if you have enough time and not too much wind, you can sculpt a decent stew pot. Your hands are better at remembering shapes than names. The workshop is little more than a shed with a roof that argues with rain. Inside, the wheel sits lopsided, unevenly balanced on packed dirt and 2 old bricks. You light a second fire here, a small one, just for your hands. You breathe on them while rubbing fingers together. Your nails are dark. Your palms are ridged like bark. You roll your shoulders and sit. The clay is cold and wet and smells faintly like the bottom of the river. Perfect. You slap it down, press it into a rough shape. The wheel creaks as you spin. Your foot taps the makeshift treadle. Slowly, rhythmically, you lean in and start pulling the clay upward, coaxing it into a bowl. Not an ornate one. You're not making art. You're making something to hold barley stew and not collapse after 2 washings. A fly buzzes past your ear. You don't swat it. Flies have become part of the soundtrack of your mornings. As the clay rises, you feel the shape speak to you. It's a language made of curve and balance. You understand it the way some men understand horses. Or debt. You think about your father's hands. How they used to hover over the clay like they were blessing it. He made amphorae once big. Proud things for wine. Not for people like you. For lords. For trade. He died before you learned how to seal a pot against winter cracks. You never told him you were going to be poor anyway. Your thumb slips, warping the rim slightly. You frown. Press gently to correct it. You lean in. Shoulders tight. There's something about getting it just right. Even if the person who uses this bowl is going to chip it on day 2 and curse your name with their mouth full of watery leek stew. You don't care. You care a little. A gust of wind shivers through the workshop, lifting a curtain of straw from the doorway. The smoke from your hand fire drifts. And for a second, you're reminded of the smell of the kiln on festival days. Those were real fires. The kind that could cook a loaf of bread in your eyebrows. Back then, there were more potters in the village. One moved to the city, one died from bad cider, one joined the monastery, convinced God needed jars. Now it's mostly just you, and your stubborn kiln, which today, thankfully, still has coal. You take the bowl and place it on a plank. It's rough. It'll dry slow. That's good. Fast means cracks. Cracks mean failure. You glance over at a pile of failed bowls and whisper to them, "Don't be lonely. This one might join you." A knock at the doorway pulls you from your muttering. It's a boy. Not yours, but village clothes. Hair like he lost a fight with a thatching brush. He holds out a coin, grimy with thumbprints and hopes. Mama says if you've got a cup, she'll trade this and some lard. You nod. Lard sounds like a feast. You rummage through your stock. Most of it is dented, overfired, or slightly cursed. You find one with a tilt. Not perfect, but it holds liquid. Mostly. You hand it to him. He grins like he just bought the moon. And you tuck the coin away and think about whether to spend it on salt or save it for when the Lord raises the grain tax again. Which he will. They always do. You turn back to the wheel. More clay, more shape, more hope. Spinning in circles. The workshop still smells like clay, smoke, and ambition that's mostly dried up. You rub your hands clean with a rag that's been soaked through and crusted over a dozen times. Your fingernails are packed with earth, and there's a streak of mud across your cheek. You don't bother wiping off. What's the point? The next lump of clay will just add another one. You step outside into a village that's barely begun to move. A mist clings to the air, thick and lazy. Chickens strut without purpose. One of them eyes your boots, as if it knows you're just a few rungs above it on the food chain, if that. The path back toward the square is lined with fences that lean like tired old men. A cart squeaks somewhere behind you. You turn your face toward the sound and catch the scent of onions, goat, and desperation. You're heading to market, not to sell nothing. Finished is ready yet, but to see if you can trade. Or beg. Or both. You've got a chipped spoon and a small coin from the boy earlier. It isn't much, but it's more than you had yesterday. The market isn't bustling. Not yet. Just a few scattered figures wrapped in cloaks. Each one moving with the slowness of someone who didn't sleep well. You nod at an old woman stirring a pot that smells like turnips and vengeance. She doesn't smile back. That's normal. You approach a man selling cheese or something, trying to impersonate cheese. You pick up a wedge. It's soft in the middle, hard at the edge, and smells like it's considering violence. You sniff. Then you don't sniff again. How much, you ask? He eyes your spoon. That, and the coin. You hesitate. It's just a spoon. Just a coin. But that's also tomorrow. Or later today if things go wrong. Still, your daughter hasn't tasted cheese in weeks. You trade. He grunts approval and wraps the wedge in a scrap of cloth that used to be part of a shirt. You nod thanks and slide it into your satchel like it's treasure, which it is. You tell yourself you'll save it. Maybe for lunch. Maybe for her birthday. Maybe for when someone cries. You wander the stall, which is generous language. Most are crates or blankets laid out with bundles of wild garlic, lumps of black bread, or buckets of dried peas. One man sells pickled something. He doesn't say what. You pass the church on the way back. Not because you're feeling particularly holy, but because it's warmer than outside. The doors are open. Smoke from a censer curling through the air like a lazy sermon. You slip inside for a moment. Feel the stillness wrap around you like an old shawl. There's no one in the pews. Just the faint creak of wood and the lingering smell of wax, pine, and secrets. You sit for a moment. Not to pray. Not quite. Just to sit. You stare at the icon of a saint whose name you never learned. He looks tired. His eyes say he's heard enough confessions and doesn't need yours to top off the week. You wonder if he was a potter, once, or hungry, or real. You don't stay long. Outside, the sun's finally dragging itself into the sky like it owes someone rent. The clouds pull back, reluctantly, revealing a winter sky the color of old tin. The air doesn't warm. It just gets brighter. You head home. On the way, you pass 3 boys throwing rocks at a frozen puddle. One of them slips and falls. The others laugh. You don't stop them. You're not the constable. You're not even a father to any of them. But still, for a second, you imagine telling them to stop. Then you imagine getting hit with a rock for the trouble. You keep walking. cart creaks past. The driver nods. His horse looks worse than your boots. It wheezes with every step, steam puffing from its nose like it's practicing to be a dragon. You wonder if you could trade for the manure, use it for the garden, or heat, or just to remember what horses smell like. At home. The door groans again. The fire's low, but not dead. Your wife is awake now, kneeling by the hearth, stirring something in the pot. You can smell parsnips and hope. She glances at you, sees the cloth in your hand. Cheese, she says, softly. You nod. She doesn't smile, but her shoulders drop slightly. You hand it over. We'll save it, she says. You already knew that. But hearing it helps. Your daughter is drawing shapes in the ash by the hearth. One looks like a star. One looks like a goat. One might be you. You tousle her hair and sit down beside her. The floor is still cold, but your bones have adjusted. Lunch will come. Maybe not soon, but maybe soon enough. You lean back, eyes on the fire. Your stomach growls again, and this time you don't shush it. You let it speak. It's earned that right. The house smells better than it has in days. The parsnip is boiling into softness, its sweetness teasing the air. There's even a sprig of something green in the pot, wild thyme. Maybe. Or one of the mystery herbs your neighbors swore would ward off cough and husbands. You don't care what it does as long as it doesn't taste like despair. You crouch by the fire, watching the bubbles rise, break, and vanish in the thin broth. This is the midday meal. Not quite lunch. Not quite survival ration. You don't call it anything. Really. It just is a small promise that the second half of the day might be endurable. Your wife ladles it carefully into wooden bowls. Yours has a crack that leaks if you tilt it too far, so you cradle it like a newborn chick with separation anxiety. The warmth seeps into your palms, and for a moment, it feels like enough. Your daughter eats first. No one says this out loud anymore. It's just what happens. She sits cross-legged near the hearth, blowing on her spoon like it's a flute. Her cheeks are flushed from firelight and hunger. She slurps, makes a face, slurps again. She'll learn to like bitter. Your wife mutters, like the rest of us. You smile, briefly, then you eat. The soup isn't bad. It's not good either, but in a way that feels familiar. Like how your old boots don't fit perfectly, but you trust them not to betray you? It tastes of earth, smoke, and survival. You chew the soft chunks slowly. There's a single piece of barley in your bowl, and you consider saving it for last. You eat it second to last, just to prove you're not too sentimental. You break off a chunk of bread hard, slightly mold-speckled, but still chewable if you soak it in the broth. Which you do. Your teeth ache less than usual today. A small win. The cheese is still untouched. It sits wrapped in cloth on the shelf above the hearth, elevated like a holy relic. No one says it aloud, but you're all thinking the same thing. It's for later. For worse, for when someone needs a reason to keep eating. There's a kind of ritual to all this. The silence, the steam rising, the way each of you glances at the pot after your bowl is half empty, the way your wife scrapes the sides with a ladle, trying to make the last bit stretch farther than physics should allow. Outside, the sun has finally committed to its arc across the sky. Light spills through the cracks in the shutters, painting golden lines across the dirt floor. You eat slowly because rushing means returning to work. And work means, well, everything outside this warm moment. You reach for your mug of ale. It's flat, warm, and faintly sour, everything you expect it to be. You sip it like it's something worth savoring, mostly because it's all you've got. The first time you tasted ale as a child, you thought it was a mistake. Now you understand it's just water with trauma. Your wife doesn't drink today. She says she has a headache, but you know it's because she wants to save hers for later. You don't argue. She always drinks last, always eats last, even when she says she isn't hungry. You notice her eyes tracking the ladle. You offer her the crust from your bowl. She hesitates, then takes it with a nod that says, "Thank you, and also I hate that I took it." You both pretend you didn't notice the moment. Your daughter finishes first, licking her spoon with the precision of someone hoping to discover flavor hidden in the grain. She hands the bowl to you like it's a treasure, not an empty vessel. You rinse it in the warm water by the hearth, then place it upside down to dry on the shelf beside the others. 2 bowls. 3 people. It works out. Usually. A breeze slips through the door cracks. You pull your shawl tighter and rise slowly, stretching your arms above your head. Your back resents you for it. Your knees offer a rebuttal. Your spine calls for union representation. Still, you move. There's always more to do. Your daughter asks if she can go outside. You nod. She wraps herself in her too short cloak and dashes out, feet barely touching the ground. You hear her singing, faintly, a melody your mother used to hum while shelling peas. Your wife begins sweeping, more out of habit than necessity. The dirt floor never stays clean. It's like trying to tidy a sand dune with a broom made of grass and blind optimism. But she does it anyway. Motion comforts her. You collect the scraps from lunch, the root peels, the hardened crusts, the thinnest sliver of something that might have once been leek, and drop them into a smaller pot. Not for now. For later. Maybe for stew. Maybe for bait. Maybe for nothing. You pause at the hearth, staring into the coals. They pulse red and orange, like tiny hearts refusing to quit. You think of your father's funeral pyre, how the flames swallowed his body, but not the stories he told. You try to remember one of them now. Something about a goat and a hat, and a priest who wasn't actually a priest. You smile again. Small, quiet. You turn back towards the shelf, eyeing the cheese, just for a second. Then you turn away. Not yet. The fire's down to a lazy flicker now, just enough to keep the pot from sulking into cold silence. Your daughter has gone quiet outside. You hear the soft scrape of her stick across frost-covered dirt. Maybe drawing circles. Maybe playing Queen of the Chickens again. You let her be. Her world, though small, still has space for pretend. Yours lost that somewhere between your first toothache and your second winter without turnips. Your wife finishes sweeping and stands still for a moment, broom in one hand, staring out the small window cut into the wall. The view isn't much. Mostly mud and fence and 2 goats that hate each other on a spiritual level. Still, she stares, and you know what she's doing. She's counting what you have left, same as you. "Do you think the Reeve will come today?" she asks. You shake your head. "He was here 2 days ago. Took half the eggs we didn't have." She nods, slowly, as if hoping the memory changes with movement. You sit back down, cross-legged. Afternoon is here, not that it looks different from morning. Same color sky, same color ground, same aches in your joints. Just repositioned. You take the spoon you whittled last winter and start smoothing its handle again. It doesn't need smoothing, but your hands need doing. You think about what else there is to eat. There's a small cloth sack of oats in the corner, hidden beneath the stack of firewood no one wants to touch because spiders. You did the math in your head already this morning. Not enough for porridge, but maybe enough for gruel. Which is like porridge's sad, watery cousin who always brings up politics at dinner. You could go foraging, but it's not quite spring. Not yet. The nettles haven't dared to poke through the frost. The dandelions are still asleep. The wild garlic is playing hard to get. You once tried boiling moss. Once, you lie back on the floor. It's not comfortable. I think that's the point. If you get too comfortable, you won't get up again. That's the danger in warmth, in stillness, in pretending you can stop. You hear the low rumble of a cart down the path. Not close. Just enough to remind you the world keeps moving, even when you don't. Your wife sits beside you while pulling at a loose thread in her sleeve. It's a bad habit, but you've never stopped her. That sleeve's been patched so many times it's more memory than fabric. I dreamed of apples last night, she says. You don't reply, not because you don't care, but because you did too. Instead, you say, green or red. She smiles. Barely. Red? Big. With that crunch, you exhale through your nose. Liar. Red ones go soft by spring. She leans her head against your shoulder. It's the warmest thing you felt all day. Your daughter comes back inside, cheeks flushed, hands full of mud and mystery. I found something, she declares that she holds up. A rock. Not a magic rock, not a shiny one. Just a rock. But the way she holds it, you'd think it cured fever and made cheese from air. You take it, examine it like a scholar, nod gravely. This, you say, is a very important rock. She beams. You hand it back like you've returned a relic to its rightful queen. She puts it in her pocket and runs to show it to the goat, who looks unimpressed, then mildly alarmed, then indifferent. You stretch again. The bones protest louder this time. You know you'll need to chop more wood soon. You tell yourself you'll do it after the sun moves. Which is code for if I feel like I might die from guilt first. You stand anyway. Because that's the thing about survival, it rarely cares how you feel about it. Outside, the wind has picked up slightly, and it's got teeth. You wrap your shawl tighter and head to the woodpile. The axe is half buried in the ground beside it, as if someone tried to chop dirt in a fit of realism. You pull it free. Your hands remember the rhythm before your arms agree to it. The first log splits unevenly, a chunk flying off like it's late for something. You don't aim for perfection, just size, chop, stack, breathe, repeat. You get 6 good logs before your shoulder twinges in that way it does when the cold has snuck into your joints and made itself a cozy little home. You drag the wood inside, one arm full, one dragging. You stack it by the hearth, wiping your nose with the sleeve that isn't already doing something important. Your wife nods approval. She doesn't say thank you. She doesn't need to. She hands you the ladle. The bottom's getting thin. You take it, swirl the pot gently. There's not much left. But enough for tonight. Maybe the sun starts its lazy descent, and the light crawling through your window shifts from pale gray to that warm, fading gold that lies about how cold it actually is. The inside of the house dims. Shadows stretch like old dogs settling in for the night. You sit by the fire, watching the last flickers dance across the bottom of the pot, and you know it's time to light the evening flame. This isn't just about light or heat. It's about rhythm, reassurance, that no matter what the day took from you, calories, patience, dignity, the fire can still be brought back, and with it, a little bit of control. That's the real reason you keep tending it. You nudge the coals, add a sliver of dry wood, and blow. The flame returns with a sigh, like it's just as tired as you are. Your daughter clap softly. She loves watching the fire come alive. You used to, too. Your wife begins preparing the second meal. Calling it dinner would be generous. It's what's left. She empties the small cloth bundle, a few stray peels, a wilted leaf or two, the end of a carrot that probably should have been compost days ago but still isn't the worst thing you've eaten this week. You help by staying out of the way. Eventually, there's a bubbling sound. The pot sings. Not a happy song, exactly. More like the soft gurgle of obligation. You recognize it. It's the sound of we made do. You always make do. Your daughter sets the table, which, again, is ambitious phrasing. It's more like putting 3 bowls on the flattest part of the floor. She lays them out with care, like it's a feast, like there might be guests, like this isn't just the same bowls, the same pot, the same night repeating itself again with slightly different ingredients. You admire her for that. The pretending, the theater of plenty. She asks, "Can we have the cheese?" Your wife freezes. You glance up from the hearth. You feel it in your chest, that tight little pang between guilt and pragmatism. "We're saving it," your wife says gently. For when the girl asks, you don't answer, because you don't know. Because when it gets worse, feels like a curse. And saying it might summon the exact version of worse you're all trying not to imagine. Instead, you serve dinner. The broth is watery, and you can count the solids on one hand if one of your fingers is generous in rounding up. But it's warm, and the bread is still soft enough to dunk if you move quickly. You eat together. Your daughter makes a joke about the soup having more steam than substance. You laugh. It's true. You add a pinch of dried thyme, one of the last pinches from the little cloth bundle you got last spring. The smell lifts the whole pot. It tastes a little less like boiled disappointment now. And that's a win. After dinner, you clean the bowls slowly, not because you're thorough, but because the longer the bowls are in your hands, the longer it feels like there was something to eat. The water you use is lukewarm, carried in from the jug by the door. Your fingers numb after 3 rinses. Outside, night is fully here. The goats have stopped arguing. The chickens are roosting somewhere far off. Someone is singing badly, but earnestly. You recognize the tune. It's a folk song about turnips and seduction. Somehow, it's always the same 2 topics. Your daughter sits by the hearth, sketching pictures in the ash with the end of a spoon. One is of a cow. Another might be a castle. The third looks suspiciously like a slice of cheese. You settle down beside her. She leans into you. You wrap your arm around her shoulders. Her head fits perfectly into the space beneath your chin. It always has. She asks, "What did you eat when you were little?" You consider lying, telling her about feasts that didn't happen, or meals you didn't have to share, or apples that grew on trees instead of just dreams. Instead, you say, "Mostly this, sometimes less." She nods. Then, "Did you ever go to bed hungry?" You say, "Sometimes, but I always woke up." It's not really an answer, but it's true. Your wife joins you, sitting on your other side. The three of you form a little crescent around the fire, like you're holding it in place just by proximity. You tell a story, not a dramatic one. Just a memory of a day when a traveling peddler gave you a dried fig because you helped him carry a sack. You'd never had fig before. You thought it was a candy made of mud and seeds. You ate it anyway, then licked your fingers for 2 days straight, hoping some sweetness had soaked into your skin. Your daughter laughs. Your wife rolls her eyes. You bask in it. Not the story, the moment. Because these are the things that make the hunger tolerable. The fire, the togetherness, the shared lie that tomorrow might be easier. You rise eventually and bank the fire for the night. You cover the embers, pack in ash. It's not out, just sleeping. Like you will be soon. You kiss your daughter's forehead. She tastes like smoke and broth and the last breath of time. You pull a blanket over her. She's already half asleep. Your wife gives you a long look. One of those looks with whole conversations hiding inside it. You don't speak. You just nod. Tomorrow is waiting. The fire's dim now, banked under a thick layer of ash, glowing faintly like coals remembering what it meant to be bright. The house has gone quiet. Your daughter sleeps with one arm over her head, mouth slightly open, breathing slow and safe. The goats mutter outside in their dreams, or maybe just in their sleep-fueled stubbornness. Either way, the world is winding down. You, however, are not asleep. You're lying on your back, staring at the low beams of the roof, counting the cobwebs you've already cleared once this week. Your eyes ache from the firelight, but your mind is wide awake, pacing the halls of your worries like a watchman with no torch. Because even though today didn't kill you, tomorrow is already sharpening its teeth. You rise carefully, trying not to wake your wife. She's curled away from you, one hand tucked beneath her cheek, wrapped in the same blanket she was born under. You don't need to speak to know she's awake. Too, there's a kind of silence people share when they've run out of good dreams. You slip outside into the night. The cold hits your face like it's been waiting for you, sharp, honest, and entirely uninterested in your comfort. You tighten your cloak and walk slowly to the edge of the path, where the trees lean like tired sentries. Your boots crunch over frost-hardened mud. Somewhere far off, an owl argues with the dark. You pause near the fence, and that's when you see it. A shadow, barely visible in the moonlight. A shape moving toward you. You tense for a second, before recognizing the outline. A neighbor, Thomas. His gait is limpy and familiar. You can tell from how his left foot slaps down harder than the right. He lifts a hand in greeting. You do the same. He reaches the fence and holds something out through the slats. A bundle wrapped in cloth. Found a marrow bone, he says. From the manor dogs, they didn't finish it. You don't speak at first. You just look at the bundle like it might explode. Then you take it gently, reverently, like it's a letter from a god who only writes once a year. Thanks, you say, voice rough. He shrugs. Figured you'd know what to do with it. You nod. You do. Boil it. Simmer it. Let the fat rise to the surface of the pot like a holy ghost. Feed it to your daughter and watch her face change. You want to come in, you ask? He shakes his head. Too late. Too tired. Too everything. You get it? Tell your wife the cheese was good, he adds, turning to go. We got some too. You smile? We haven't touched ours yet. Smart, he says, or sad? Maybe both. He disappears into the mist. Just like that, you walk back inside and unwrap the bone. It's rough. Marrow clinging to the center. Bits of charred fat glistening like gemstones. It's heavy. Not in weight, in meaning. This could be the difference between strength and weakness. Between waking up tomorrow ready or not. You don't put it in the pot tonight. No, tonight, you lay it on the shelf, up high, next to the cheese. Let it sit there like a silent promise tomorrow. We feast. Or at least, simulate one. You lie back down beside your wife. She rolls over. Her eyes flicker to the bone. Then to you. You don't speak. Her hand finds yours in the dark. It's cold. So is yours. But together, the cold feels like something smaller. She murmurs. We'll use it for lunch. You nod. Then she adds. And you'll eat first. You nearly laugh. Not likely. She squeezes your hand. Still. You will, and just like that, you let your body sink into the stiffness of the floor. The smell of wood smoke still clings to your hair. The sound of your daughter breathing rises and falls like a lullaby you didn't know you needed. The bone sits on the shelf, waiting, like the rest of you. You fall asleep wondering what it will taste like. You wake wondering if it's still there. It is. You touch it like you're checking for fever. Your daughter stirs beside you. She sits up groggily, eyes half-lidded. Is it morning, she whispers. You nod. Is there anything to eat? You glance at the shelf, then back to her. Yes, you say, and for once, you don't have to lie. Morning comes with its usual harshness. No gentle light filtering through curtains. No birds chirping in well-placed trees, just a damp gray glow that tells your bones it's time to ache again. But today, you move with something different inside you. Purpose. Because today, there's a marrow bone on the shelf. You unwrap it like a relic. You hold it up to the firelight, rotating it like a jewel. The kids of lords get golden goblets. Your daughter gets this. And you wouldn't trade the two. Not today. You place the bone into the pot slowly, almost reverently. The metal hisses where the fat meets it. Then the smell starts. First smoke. Then pork. Then something deeper like roasted memory. Your daughter wrinkles her nose. Delighted. Is that what feasts smell like, she asks. You nod. On a good day, you add water carefully. Enough to stretch the flavor, not drown it. A few dry leaks. A chunk of turnip that hasn't given up entirely. A stale crust of bread to thicken the broth. You stir. It begins to look like a meal made on purpose. Your wife appears behind you, sleepy-eyed, but already tying her scarf. We'll share it with the old man next door, she says. Not a question. You nod again? Of course, she pours a bit of weak ale into the mix. Not for the buzz, there's no buzz left in that brew. Just for the depth. Just for the warmth. Just because it tastes less like sadness when it's familiar. Your daughter dances by the fire, humming something that might be a song or might just be joy. You let her. By the time the pot is truly bubbling, the whole house smells alive. The old man next door arrives with a walking stick that's more optimism than structure. You set a place for him. The place being the smoothest patch of dirt and the least wobbly bowl. He eats slowly. I remember the smell, he says, between bites. Had it once 20 years back. A wedding. You all pretend not to notice he's crying a little, or that your wife is too. Even you feel something rising in your chest, like warmth from deep underground. Not a full emotion, just a whisper of one. The pot empties faster than usual. The marrow turns the broth into silk. The bread absorbs it like a sponge and becomes something resembling indulgent. Your daughter licks her bowl clean. You do too. The old man tries but gives up halfway and simply sucks on the spoon. Afterward, no one speaks for a while. Not because there's nothing to say, but because silence feels like the right way to thank a bone. When the guests leave and the bowls are rinsed, you find yourself with time. Dangerous, idle time. So you go to the fields. Not to work. Not yet, but to check. The ground is still hard. The frost hasn't lifted, you know? But there are signs. It's a weed you can't name. Sprouting between stones. A patch of soil that smells a little more like earth and a little less like death. You kneel and press your fingers into the dirt. Not deep. Just enough to say I'm still here. The crows call overhead. One of them lands nearby. Watches you. Cocks its head. No spread today? You tell it. It flies off, unimpressed. You return to the house with a small bundle of dried herbs, thyme, nettle, and something that might be mint. Your wife raises an eyebrow. It'll help the gruel, you say. She smiles, just barely. The kind of smile that needs scaffolding. By evening, you're back around the fire. The pot is empty again, but the smell of the bone still clings to the room like perfume for people who can't afford perfume. Your daughter has fallen asleep in your lap. Your wife is sewing a patch into a pair of socks you haven't had the heart to throw away yet. The air is cold, but your core is warm. You tell a story about a fox who stole a turnip and then tricked a noble into thinking it was gold. It's not a good story, but it gets a laugh. One real laugh and one snort. You'll take it. Later, when everyone's asleep, you bank the fire and glance at the pot. Empty. Of course it is. But you place the lid on it anyway. With care. Because tomorrow, who knows? The world might surprise you again. With a bone. With a weed. With a neighbor. Or maybe just with enough. The wind shifts overnight. You feel it in your sleep before you hear it. That high, whistling pitch of air slicing through the cracks in the wood. The sigh of the roof beams adjusting to another pressure system they never signed up for. You pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders, half conscious, waiting for your body to tell you whether it's still night or just an especially bitter morning. It's morning. Not because the light has changed, it hasn't, but because your daughter is coughing and your knees have begun their ritual mutiny. Your wife is already up. You can hear her stirring the fire with the patience of a monk and the posture of someone who gave up on lumber health before she could spell lumbar. She meets your eyes when you sit up. The cellar's leaking again, she says flatly. You don't curse, that will be giving the weather too much satisfaction. Instead, you nod. Let's go look. The cellar is less a room and more a hole in the ground that someone once lined with stones and optimism. The ladder down is damp, the kind of damp that sticks to your bones and makes your knuckles suddenly recall every injury you ever ignored. You descend first. The air is thick with the scent of mold, wet straw, and betrayal. The sacks of barley are damp around the edges. You touch the bottom of one. It squishes. Not the way barley should. You squeeze your eyes shut for a moment, not to pray, but to delay. Half the grain is ruined. Maybe more. You pull out the good handfuls. Slowly, as if that'll make them multiply. You scrape off the soft green fuzz from the edges. One sack has a mouse hole in it. You don't even blame the mouse. You might have done the same. Your wife joins you and silently begins separating the salvageable bits. Neither of you talks. This isn't a conversation moment. This is a shared mourning. Not for the grain, but for the weeks it was supposed to represent. Back upstairs, your daughter is sitting by the hearth, still rubbing her eyes. You don't tell her yet. You won't. Not until you have a plan that sounds better than chew faster to trick your stomach. You spread the good grain on a flat cloth near the fire. It'll dry, eventually. If the mice don't get it first, what now, your wife asks, you rub your temples. We use the rest of the oat sack. And whatever roots haven't turned to sadness, she nods, not looking up. Later. She pulls out the bundle from under the bed, what's left of the emergency stash. A few carrots that think they're fossils, a dried apple with dreams of redemption, and a chunk of garlic so old it's sprouted a tiny green tail. You stare at it. Should we name it? She smirks. Only if it survives longer than we do. You throw it into the pot with dramatic flair. Congratulations. Gerald, your dinner. You both chuckle. It's not much, but it's oxygen for the soul. The gruel you make is ambitious. It's mostly water, with a few bits of oat and a heroic attempt at seasoning. You add dried nettles from last summer, plus a pinch of salt saved from that one lucky trade with the peddler who thought your cracked bowl was quaint. The result tastes like it's trying to be nutritious while also preparing you for disappointment. Your daughter doesn't complain, which tells you she's either matured or has lost all remaining sense of culinary expectations. You all eat in silence. No one reaches for the cheese. Not today. After breakfast, your wife goes to visit a neighbor whose child has the cough. She takes a bundle of herbs and one of your bowls, the nicer one. You nod approval as she leaves. The gift isn't about barter. It's about insurance. Kindness circulates like shared warmth. You give today so that maybe someone will give tomorrow. You stay home to patch the wall near the goats. One of them has been chewing it again, which is your fault for naming him Trouble and feeding him onion skins once. He follows you around while you work, bumping your leg occasionally like a toddler who learned passive aggression. You scold him. He sneezes on your boot. Fair enough. Back inside. You take stock of everything: 2 heels of bread, a sliver of lard, the cheese untouched. As always, 1 clove of garlic, now named Gerald II, and the memory of a marrow bone. You're not out of food, but you're approaching the part of the map labeled, Here Be Dragons. Still, the fire is warm. Your daughter is humming again. And when you catch your wife's eye, there's no panic there. Just calculation. You can work with that. Tomorrow will require creativity. But today still counts as a win. By evening, the wind decides to get personal. It slaps the side of the house like it's demanding rent, slips under the doorframe like a thief, and whistles through the eaves with all the subtlety of a drunk monk. You've stuffed the cracks with straw and old cloth, but the cold still finds you. It always does. You wrap another layer around your shoulders, which technically is a curtain, but no one's using it for privacy these days. Your wife is stirring the pot again, and not because there's something new in it. Sometimes she stirs it just to feel like there's motion, like the day hasn't stopped giving. Tonight's dinner is less about food and more about memory. You're stretching the last handful of oats with water, the smallest spoon of lard, and a crushed acorn from the stash you swore you'd never touch. Acorns are for desperate times. Congratulations. Your daughter peers into the pot. It smells nutty. That's the hope. Your wife replies, could be bark. You try to laugh, but it comes out more like a wheeze. Not because you're sick, just because you're tired of chewing air and calling it broth. Still, it cooks. Still, you sit down and eat together. The acorn gruel is bitter, earthy, and vaguely resentful. You chew slowly, thinking of better meals that probably never happened. And your daughter makes that squinty face she always makes when she's deciding whether to ask for honey or just accept her fate. She doesn't ask. Smart girl. Afterward, you clean the bowls with warm water and ash. It doesn't work well, but it's the same method everyone uses, so it feels traditional. At least. You set them on a shelf, upside down, like they're napping. Then comes the real work of the night. You gather your tools and your shawl. You're going to the edge of the village, the trees, the ditch, the stone wall that used to mark someone's field before the floods made a joke of ownership. You're going to forage. It's not noble. It's not even smart. Not this late and not with this wind, but the pot is getting too quiet, and tomorrow is always hungrier than today. You make your way slowly, lantern in hand, boots crunching on frost. Every twig snap feels louder than it should. Every breeze sounds like a whisper you weren't meant to hear. You reach the ditch first. Nettles. Thin ones. Not enough for stew, but enough to say you tried. You pick them carefully. Despite the sting, they remind you you're still alive. Next, mushrooms. You know the ones that kill. Mostly. You leave the ones that argue with your memory. Then you see it. A piece of apple peel. On the ground. Wrinkled, browned. Nearly mush, but you pick it up like it's gold. Someone tossed it. Maybe a child. Maybe a lord who thought core meant trash. You take it home anyway. Back in the cottage, your wife greets you with a look that's half worry, half admiration, and fully exhausted. She takes the nettles without comment. The apple peel she handles like a newborn. You throw it all into the pot, not because it makes sense, but because everything helps. You add more water. You stir. The smell changes slightly. Just enough to make your daughter lift her head and sniff the air like a fox. Is that apple, kind of, you say? She smiles like it's her birthday. Your wife whispers. Maybe tomorrow we open the cheese. You nod. Maybe? But you both know that's a lie. The cheese is a symbol now, and symbols last longer than calories. You go to bed that night with a stomach that's not full, but no longer empty. That's the sweet spot in peasant life. Just enough to not think about food while you sleep. The wind keeps howling and you keep breathing. The fire flickers one last time, and you let yourself believe that somehow you'll have more to put in the pot tomorrow. Not because it's likely, but because belief is free and tastes better than bark. The world greets you with rain. Not a cleansing kind. Not the poetic drizzle that makes poets feel important. This is the kind that soaks through your cloak in under a minute, finds the holes in your boots you forgot about, and settles into your spine like unpaid rent. It taps on the thatch roof with a rhythm that says, "Hope you weren't planning anything ambitious." You wake up to the smell of damp wool and regret. The fire didn't go out, but it's sulking. The coals hiss as a droplet sneaks through a crack and lands with a smug little sizzle. Your daughter is still asleep, curled tight under a blanket that's technically a sack that once held barley. Your wife's already up, pressing a cloth to the window ledge to slow the leak that's become a seasonal guest. She doesn't curse, but her shoulders do. You check the pot. It's nearly empty. Just a film of last night's broth and a single nettle leaf clinging to the side like it's afraid to face what's coming next. You add water. Again. Always again. This is where the magic happens. The illusion that more water equals more meal. Today's plan was to walk to the manor to ask about winter scraps. Maybe someone's throwing out a cabbage core. Maybe there's leftover gristle from a feast that involved actual meat and laughter. But with the rain, you might drown before disappointment gets a chance to greet you. Still, you wrap yourself in layers cloak, shawl, resolve. Before you leave, your wife hands you a small pouch with the last usable coin. "Trade for salt if you can," she says. "If not, just come back." She doesn't say it like a joke, because sometimes people don't. The manor is half a mile away, up the muddy slope that used to be a road. You walk slowly, slipping often, muttering prayers to deities you've never formally met. Your boots make that squelch sound you hate. Every step feels like a negotiation. When you arrive, you're soaked, shivering, and very aware that you smell like a fireplace that gave up halfway. The manor cook greets you with a look that says, "I'm paid too little to pretend to like you." You bow slightly, just enough to acknowledge the hierarchy, but not enough to look desperate, which, of course, you ask if there's anything left. She hands you a sack, not kindly, not cruelly, just efficiently. Inside 2 chicken necks, a soft onion, and something that might be a rind or might be soap. You thank her like she gave you a kingdom. You trudge home, sack tucked under your cloak like contraband. The rain hasn't let up, but now it feels personal, like it knows you're carrying something worth having. When you return, your wife lifts the sack, opens it, and lets out a single breath of real relief. "We'll make broth," she says. Real broth. You add everything to the pot. The necks go in whole. The onion is chopped, eyes stinging. The possible soap. You scratch it, sniff it, taste a corner, then decide it's edible. Probably, the smell is instant. Rich, salty, alive. Even the goats perk up. Your daughter claps when she sees the pot steaming. "Does this mean we're rich?" she asks. Temporarily. You reply, "You eat like royalty that night." Which, to be fair, is still mostly liquid and a lot of chewing around bones. But the broth is flavorful. The warmth is full-bodied. The spoon feels heavier in your hand. Your wife dips her bread into the soup, eyes closed like she's remembering how things used to taste before the world got stingy. Later, as your daughter sleeps with a full belly and the fire dances happily in the hearth, you lean back and whisper the word you rarely allow yourself enough. Because tonight, you don't need more. Tonight, you have warmth. You have food. You have each other. And a pot that smells like hope. The rain finally stops. Not with a flourish or a rainbow, but with the kind of awkward silence that follows someone leaving mid-conversation. The sky stays low and gray, like it's not quite done being moody, but at least the dripping has stopped. The roof still leaks in 3 places, but at least you're not collecting new leaks. The morning begins with a cautious kind of optimism. The pot still holds a finger's depth of broth. Rich, golden. Thick with whatever the chicken necks decided to give up overnight. Your daughter pokes her finger into it and licks it like it's honey. Your wife shoos her away. Not because she's wrong, just because it's not breakfast yet. You gather what's left of the barley from yesterday's disaster and sort through it one last time. The moldy grains are dark green now, bold and unapologetic. You pick around them like a surgeon, careful not to breathe in the smell too deeply. There's just enough clean barley to be worth soaking. While you stir the pot, your wife brings out the cloth-wrapped relic from the top shelf. The cheese. Your daughter gasps like she's witnessing a miracle. You raise an eyebrow. Your wife simply says, "I had a dream." We used it. You don't argue with dreams. She unwraps it slowly. The smell hits first sharp, sour, slightly floral, slightly threatening. You all lean in like it's a campfire or an oracle. It's hard as stone at the edges, but the center yields to pressure, soft and creamy. She slices it carefully, like performing surgery with a dull blade. Each of you gets a piece no larger than a coin. It tastes like memory. You chew slowly, eyes closed, letting the fat coat your mouth and trick your brain into thinking this is what luxury feels like. Your daughter hums as she eats, swaying slightly, like she's just heard her favorite song. The moment doesn't last, but that's the point. Moments never do. You spend the rest of the morning outside, patching the coop roof with whatever didn't rot over winter. The chickens complain the entire time. Loudly. One pecks your boot and gives you the kind of look that says, "If I had thumbs, you'd be toast." You toss her a crumb. She forgives you. The village feels alive today. The rain has knocked down the dust and people are emerging from their huts and hovels like mushrooms after a storm. A neighbor passes by and nods at you. He has a bucket of turnips and a limp. You nod back. Everyone has something. You trade him a cracked bowl for a handful of soft pears if they're bruised. But sweet. You eat one on the way home. Juice sticky on your fingers. The core saved for your daughter. You imagine planting the seeds. You won't. But you imagine it. When you get back, the pot is bubbling again. Your wife has added the rest of the barley, the bones, the final chunk of onion, and miracle of miracles, a pinch of rosemary from the garden's last harvest. It smells like a feast. Your daughter dances around the room, making up a song about soup. It has no melody and even less logic, but you'd pay silver to hear it again in 10 years. You sit to eat, and for the first time in days, you get 2 ladles instead of 1. The bread is gone. The cheese is a memory. But this is abundance. Even the fire agrees. It burns bright, steady, strong. You don't need to coax it. It doesn't need praise. It just does its job. Like you. After dinner, your wife sets aside a jar of broth for the old man next door. She walks it over with a smile, wrapped in cloth like a gift from someone with options. Your daughter crawls into your lap and asks, "Can we eat like this every day?" You smile the kind of smile that hides a lot of math. "We'll try," you say. And maybe you will. Because the pot isn't empty tonight. Because you remembered what cheese tastes like. Because your house smells like something other than survival. You sit beside the fire a little longer. The coals glow. Your belly rests. And your hope briefly quietly stretches its arms and settles in. By now, you know the rhythm of things. Wake up, check the fire, check the pot, check your bones. One will be cold, one will be empty, one will refuse to cooperate. If you're lucky, it's not all three on the same morning. Today, it's just the fire. You poke it awake with a bit more force than necessary. It responds with a sulky crackle, as if to say, "Fine," but only because you asked nicely. There's a strange stillness outside. Not silence exactly, just a lack of the usual morning complaints. No goats arguing, no chickens announcing their mediocre eggs, no neighbors swearing about mud or wood shortages. It's like the village is holding its breath. You open the door and see why. Snow, not heavy, not enough to bury anything. Just a fine, shimmering dusting of it across every surface like the world got up early and powdered its nose. It won't last, but for now, it makes the world look clean. Holy. Even your daughter squeals when she sees it. She runs outside barefoot before you can stop her. You shout after her half-heartedly. Let her have this. Let her leave tracks before the sun erases them. Your wife's already mixing what's left of the barley with hot water and stirring the broth jar you saved yesterday. The snow falling outside makes the warmth inside feel earned. She hums softly, and for a brief moment, it sounds like wealth. Today is for maintenance, mending cloaks, scraping ash from the hearth, sharpening the blade and the hand axe you'll need next week when firewood becomes your main concern again. You stretch the morning like a too thin blanket, pretending it reaches further than it does. And then midday comes. With it, something strange. A knock at the door. You exchange glances with your wife. You weren't expecting anyone, not unless the tax man got lost. And even he isn't brave enough to climb a hill in snow. You open the door slowly. It's a boy. Not from the village. You'd recognize the boots. These are newer, cleaner. His cheeks are flushed from the cold, and he carries a parcel wrapped in waxed cloth. He holds it out. "For you," he says. No smile. From the manor. You blink. You take it. He leaves before you can ask who or why. Inside. You unwrap the cloth carefully and it's still warm. Inside a chunk of soft bread, a half onion, 2 finger-length carrots, and a piece of smoked meat. Not large, but real. You can smell it before you see it. Your stomach reacts before your mind catches up. You sit down on the floor. Your wife stares. Your daughter leans in like she's watching magic. You divide it with practiced hands, bread into thirds, meat into pieces smaller than reason suggests. The carrots are scrubbed, sliced, added to the pot. The onion, what's left after trimming, is tossed in whole, because flavor is flavor. The meat, you sear just for a second, just long enough to crisp the edge. The smell hits the ceiling and bounces back down like a prayer. You save one slice for your daughter, one for your wife. The rest is cut into strips, dissolved in stew. When it's done, it smells like memory and mercy. The three of you eat like you've never eaten before, like this is the first pot that's ever steamed. Your daughter says it's better than anything she's ever had. She's right. You ask your wife what she thinks. She doesn't answer. She just tears up a little and mutters something about spice. There is no spice. You eat slowly. You clean the bowls extra carefully. You wrap the waxed cloth to reuse it later, maybe to carry something important. Maybe to remember this day. You tell your daughter a story about the time you traded an old spoon for a single egg and dropped it on the way home. You were 12. You cried so hard. Your mother gave you her own dinner without saying a word. Your daughter laughs. Your wife rolls her eyes. And the fire burns brighter than it has in days. Later, before sleep, you step outside and look toward the manor. Just past the hill, hidden by fog and class. You wonder who sent the parcel. Maybe the cook. Maybe a scullery girl who heard your name once. Maybe it was meant for someone else entirely. You don't care. You close the door and smile. Because tonight your house smells like meat. And meat means something good happened. Even if you don't know why. Morning brings a kind of quiet that feels earned. The fire still smolders. The air isn't quite warm, but it isn't biting either. Outside, yesterday's snow has softened into slush, sparkling like crushed glass where the sun manages to break through. Your daughter sleeps in, for one. Your wife doesn't wake her. Neither do you. Breakfast is modest, just the last of the broth thinned with water and imagination, but your body accepts it like it's a feast. The memory of smoked meat still lingers in the pot, a whisper of richness that turns plain barley into something almost elegant. Almost. You spend the morning doing small things, repairing the hinge on the door with an old nail and some well-placed muttering, turning the compost heap, feeding the chickens, who respond with their usual mixture of suspicion and rude commentary. Trouble, the goat, tries to eat your cloak again. You let him chew a corner. You're feeling generous. Later, you head into the woods with your daughter, not deep, just far enough to look for fallen branches and edible weeds. She finds a patch of sorrel and picks it like treasure. You show her how to tell good mushrooms from bad ones. She pretends to know already. You let her believe it. On the way back, she asks the question, were you ever scared when you were little? You think about it, about sleeping through storms with nothing but a wooden spoon tucked under your head. About the time your brother got sick and you traded your winter socks for a handful of garlic. About the night the fire went out and your father cried for the first time. Yes, you say, but I didn't stay scared. She nods like that makes perfect sense. At home. Your wife's made stew again. It's thin, but it has sorrel now. A bright, lemony bite that turns the bland into bearable. You add a few mushroom slices. She adds a pinch of something that smells like spring. You eat together. Later, your neighbor stops by with a handful of dried beans and a story about how his pig escaped and ended up in the mill pond. You laugh. You don't remember the last time you laughed before food. You trade him one of your daughter's drawings for the beans. He insists it's the best deal he's made all year. That evening, you do something strange. You open the cupboard, and you take down the cheese. It's smaller now. Time and temptation have chipped away at it, but it's still good. You cut a thin slice for each of you. Your daughter stares at hers like it's glowing. You toast a crust of bread near the fire. Melt the cheese over it. It drips a little. Bubbles slightly. She takes a bite. Eyes wide. She says, full-mouthed. It's like if butter in heaven had a baby. You chuckle. Write that down. We'll tell the monks. You sit there, all of you, near the fire, watching the logs crumble into embers. No one's hungry. Not really, and not right now. And in a world like this, that's a miracle worth savoring. Your wife looks over at you. You think it's always been like this? You raise an eyebrow, like what she gestures vaguely. People scraping by, laughing anyway. You nod, probably. She sighs. Then maybe we're doing it right. You don't answer. You just pass her the last piece of crust. She breaks it in half and gives it back. The fire burns low, but you don't add more wood just yet. You're watching it flicker, studying how the light dances along the walls, casting crooked shadows on the beams like your home is telling stories back to you. You can almost hear it whisper, "You made it another day." Your daughter is asleep again, curled beside the hearth with one hand tucked under her cheek, and the other still holding a piece of charcoal she was using to draw a cow that looks suspiciously like the goat. Trouble snores outside, loudly. Your wife sits beside you, mending a cloak that's more thread than cloth now, humming something soft and familiar. You exhale, long and slow. Not because anything extraordinary happened today, but because nothing terrible did. And that, in this life, is cause for celebration. You remember a story your grandfather told about a winter where nothing grew, and they boiled bark until it bled tannins, and every meal left their mouths raw. You remember the silence in his voice when he talked about his sister, how she never made it to spring. You look at your daughter's sleeping face. She made it to spring. There are still dried beans in the corner, and half a jug of ale. The pot is already half filled for tomorrow's meal. You've got nettles drying above the hearth, and a promise from your neighbor to trade for eggs when the hen stops being dramatic. There's a system now. Not a perfect one, not a plan with guarantees, but something that feels survivable. You rise and step outside. The night is cool, not cold. The stars are out, so many of them. More than you can count with fingers and toes. You stare up and wonder how many people, across how many winters, have stood exactly where you are, thinking the same thing. Is this enough? And tonight, for once, the answer is yes. You go back inside, pull the blanket higher on your daughter's shoulders. Your wife meets your eyes. No words. Just the look that says, "We did good today." And you did. You sit by the fire one last time, stretching your legs, warming your palms. You know tomorrow will come with new problems. The pot will empty again. The fire will fade. The grain will run low. But now you also know what to do when that happens. You stir the pot. You stretch the bread. You share first. You tell a joke. Even when the food's bad. You save the good bits for the ones who need them more. You endure. Because that's what you do. Because that's what they did. And somehow, against every odd, you're still here. And now, as the fire dims to the softest amber glow and the last breath of the day curls into the rafters. Let yourself settle. Let your body grow heavy like old wool. The pot is clean. The bread is gone. The storm has passed for now. Somewhere, a goat grumbles. Somewhere, a chicken turns in her sleep. But in here, it's quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes when you've done everything you could. When no more words are needed. When the only sound that matters is the slow, steady breath of the people you love resting near the fire. You've eaten what you had. You've shared what little was extra. And tomorrow it can wait. Tonight, you've earned this stillness. So lean into it. Let your feet relax. Let your fingers uncurl. Let the weight of the day slip away like steam from a cooling bowl. There will always be hunger in the world. There will always be work and weather and moments when the cupboard echoes too loudly. But there will also be soup and laughter and warmth passed from hand to hand like a secret kept alive through winter after winter. Close your eyes. You're not alone in this quiet. You are part of every fire that was ever tended, every bowl ever scraped clean, every person who whispered, "We'll be okay," and meant it. So rest easy. Wherever you are, Montreal, Calgary, Toronto, or a tiny village that lives only in your imagination. Let the fire burn low. Let the pot sit still. You've done enough. Good night.